Hello, and welcome to the latest podcast run by IP Inclusive to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of IP Inclusive. Today, we're going to be discussing unconscious bias in the IP workplace and hopefully look at some actionable strategies to address it. As always, I'm joined by Jodie Bates, who will be moderating with me. Jodie is an IT trainer at Boult Wade Tennant and is part of IP Inclusive. Hi, Jodie.
Hello.
And today we've got special guests with us. We have Vandita Chandrani, who is head of IP at Electa and is very active in the DEI space, both for her company and the wider profession. Hi, Vandita.
Hi, Max.
And we're also joined by Suzanne Oliver, who is director of IP strategy at Scintilla, the patent and trademark attorney firm, and is also very active with IP Inclusive and on DEI in general. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Max.
Hi, great to have you both with us. So I suppose hopefully an easy way to kick off is to ask what is probably an obvious question. What is unconscious bias? I don't know, Suzanne, maybe you can sort of kick us off on that. We can hopefully all chip in.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely give you my view, but I
Mm,
think to start with, maybe more of a sort of technical definition. As far as I'm
mm,
aware of it, unconscious bias is something that everybody has or everyone exhibits. Sort of physiologically, it was sort of occurred in the human brain in development in terms of fight or flight response. So you'd see a lion in the jungle and you know to run away. You see a tribe come into your area that doesn't look like you, so you know that they're not part of your tribe, they're strangers, so you should be, fearful. So what happens when something occurs like that? Your amygdala responds with fight or flight, and you effectively get a fear reaction. So obviously, we're not in the jungle anymore. We're not
mm,
in tribes, but in effect, in day-to-day life, these things happen when somebody presents themselves in front of us generally who doesn't look like us, behave like us, or fit our sense of group or cohort. So it could be someone with a different skin color, could be different gender, could be just someone with a different neurodiversity, or even just a different personality, or from a different country with a different accent, or whatever it may be. And what we do is we make biased decisions based on that instantaneous reaction, and we cannot stop it happening. Obviously, we'll go on to this. There's another,
mm.
point is if we're aware of these things, then we can objectively do something about it. So yeah, Vandita, though,
Yeah.
that was a kind of very academic response, but
Mm.
would love to get your input on that one as well.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you gave the academic response because that was, textbook perfect. I read a quote actually, which I just wanted to share now, and I can't credit the quote to any particular place. So apologies for that. But I read that within the first 7 seconds of interacting with a stranger, you make an average of 11 judgments about that stranger. You then
Wow.
continue to observe the person, the behaviors, and whatever else. And your subconscious brain uses all the information that you're gathering to validate the original judgment. So I think instinctively your brain is working really hard to back its first thoughts up. And of course, your brain may subconsciously see something, hear something, smell something, appreciate something that causes it to challenge those initial thoughts. But your brain's fundamental purpose is to try and back it up. And
Mm.
so,
Mm,
to follow on from what Suzanne said, it's no surprise that in those initial moments, these kind of judgments are formed and the biases are sort of put into place because you have enough going on with your surroundings and, thinking about what you need to say, what you need to communicate, shaking somebody's hand, like whatever it is, there's so much going on that your brain thinks it's its job to do this in the background. And so, as Suzanne said, it's very hard to
mm.
instantly kind of realize that it's happening and to stop.
Yeah, I mean, how do you, I suppose it's not an easy answer, but how do you stop your brain or fight against your brain from trying to confirm your initial sort of bias as you say? It must be probably a very difficult thing to be able to do, to try and, fight against that.
Yeah, I don't think you can. I think
Mm,
this is half the point, that
yeah.
it's one of these things that, once you know the cat's in the cat's in the box, and arguing the cat isn't in the box is just not going to help you. Accepting it's there, and
Mm,
then, wondering what to do next, feed it, look after it, take it somewhere, whatever. Weird analogy, but, kind of go with me. That's what you do next. So again, I love Vandita's way of putting that. I haven't heard
mm,
it put like that before, but the way that I've done unconscious bias training, and the way I've thought about it since, is the more that you understand where your natural biases are, and they will have been created through your upbringing, and there is no way on this planet you can change nurture, the
mm,
first 15 years of your life, for example. You can't go back and change those. But if you understand what might have occurred in those first 15, 16, 20 years, and then where your biases, natural biases, might lie, and you understand that there's over 100, you know, human biases, and they're listed and you can read books on them, then what you can do is educate self, which is always the first step,
mm,
reflect on self, and then put objective decision making in as a catch all, to make sure that you're not therefore making decisions based on those first 7 seconds. And you can bring other people's views in, for example, other factors and evidence, for example, into that into that
mm.
decision that you need to make.
What is your unconscious bias, something your training? What does that sort of incorporate? Are you doing that within your organization, or is that something you do externally? How does that work?
Well, this was when I was in House at Arm,
Mm,
and you tend to find in corporates, and this is a huge, again, every time someone makes these statements, you always have to look at it, are we making a general statement or are we making a specific statement? So there are some amazing IP counsel firms in private practice, but I would say, in my experience, which is a bias, that generally corporates are a little bit ahead of councils. I mean, firms, they're
mm,
bigger, and they're usually publicly floated, so they have a
mm,
higher requirement. But when I was at Arm in-house, they rolled out unconscious bias training right across the company, because in electronics, semiconductors, and computing, we have the same problem as we have in IP, which is a higher number of women going in, but a lower level of numbers at senior leadership levels, and where's that attrition and what's happening. So that was the problem that Arm were hoping to solve, along with other DE and I kind of initiatives. And so they brought unconscious training into the company.
Jodie, what's the situation at Boult? Is there unconscious bias training going on there, or do you just sort of know of it, or?
We are aware of unconscious bias here at Boult. We do discuss it in our DE&I focus work group, which I'm also part of here. It's nice that, Suzanne, you've mentioned that everyone has it. If someone said to me, you're being biased, if I've made a comment and someone's then followed up and said, you're being biased, it's something that I would actually get quite upset about. It's the level of assumption that bias is a bad thing. But as you say, everyone has it, everyone does it. It's just one of those things that's ingrained in you. And like Vandita said, it's about upbringing. So it's obviously what you do after that is key, and that's important. Suzanne, when you was mentioning the technicalities of what conscious unbiased is, and the key point that you were saying about people coming into your tribe that may look different and you have the conscious unbiased, the first thing that came to my mind, and I'm giggling, is my cats and my dog. Is this why my cats don't like my dog and my dog doesn't like my cat? It's another four-legged animal, but it's that assumption that person, not person, but that animal looks different, be wary. So they have it also. It's not just humans, but it's other mammals, other animals as well. It's the fight or flight, as you were saying, how it's ingrained in you. and Vandita, what you were saying about the 7-second rule, I've actually learned this quite young in my very first ever job. I used to do the induction training there as well, and it was part of our customer service training, more so to do with tones of voice when dealing with customers on the phone. But you do form an impression straight away within the first 7 seconds, sometimes even less. It probably in this day and age is probably less now. And it's just how you react, how you follow up. So if first 7 seconds you get your impression, everyone's opinion is open to change. But it's then I'm very conscious of and mindful of the impression that I get, and then making sure that my body language doesn't follow with that. So how I'm standing, if I've got my arms crossed, whether I've got my fists open or closed, and facial expression as well. I'm very mindful of that when talking with people.
Yeah, from my side, I think that the unconscious bias is uncontrollable, but what you do with it is controllable. And I'm struggling with this now myself because I have so much that I want to say. But as a general practice in life, I always advocate for slowing down. Take a pause. If you are aware of, the different types of bias and the way in which you may be impacted by it, and it's not all negative, by the way, unconscious bias doesn't in and of itself mean that you are behaving in a way that is negative. Much of it is positive too. But if you do educate yourself, increase your awareness, recognize where it might have an impact on you that leads you to behave in a way that perhaps is not fair or equal, you can make yourself pause. And so rather than reacting in that 7 seconds, you can slow yourself down and give yourself, your conscious brain, time to catch up with your subconscious brain, because you don't have to listen to the subconscious part of it. And that would be my kind of first tip in any kind of engagement where you are, particularly if you're meeting somebody for the first time. I'm interviewing at the moment for somebody to join our team, and I'm very, very aware of it at the moment, and it can go in all different directions. But I really try and take that second beyond the 7 seconds to pause and check myself on what I'm reacting to. Is it my subconscious brain or is it my conscious brain?
Do you think it's always obvious when someone is displaying unconscious bias in the way that they react to something or the way that they say something or the things they do, or can the person who has got the bias, within them, can it be not even noticeable at first, or is it sort of often noticeable, would you say?
I
And
would say
yeah,
it's probably not noticeable.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and sometimes as the person who's perhaps on the receiving end of the bias,
mm,
you wouldn't necessarily know whether it was subconscious or conscious,
mm,
because there are people in the world who recognize the bias, it may be conscious, and they choose to do the thing that is not kind, not fair,
mm,
not equal. And that's why this exists, because I mean, we wouldn't be having these conversations if everything in the world was equal and fair. That's kind of the point of this.
mm.
So yeah, I don't know that I would know if I was on the receiving end of unconscious bias or not. I would always like to give the benefit of the doubt that it is subconscious bias rather than conscious, but I don't know, if I would be able to categorically say one way or another.
Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting that question marks. I've never really thought about it like that. I mean, obviously you have at the extreme, sexism,
Mm.
racism, discriminatory behavior against someone with disabilities, but we're talking about this like massive grey area up to that, I would a great way of putting it, sort of conscious bias, the sort of unconscious bias in its very definition is unrecognized. You don't realize you're doing it. I think what Vandita and I are saying is if you accept the fact that there are conclusions that you will jump to and decisions that you will make that have a bias element, but stop before you make that decision and pause, and or as I said earlier, you know, bring in other views or have some objective criteria, then that's when you can start to pick up your own biases. I mean, there's a great set of tests that you can do as well, the Harvard AIT tests. I did the one around women in work, just to see, and actually came out with a much stronger bias against women in work than I was expecting, given a woman in work. And when I read the nice, really helpful supporting wording they provide, it was because I was born in 1973 and therefore grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where TV programs, governments, stories, movies were all telling me that, you know, women stayed at home and looked after their children. So no wonder by the time I get into decision making and recruitment levels, I have a mild to medium bias against women who choose to work over staying home and looking after their children. As soon as you realise that, then you can double check every decision you're making when you have a woman in your team, or a parent even. You know, it sort of doesn't necessarily mean that you're biased against women. You're biased against parents who wish to, you know, co-parent or parent.
Do you think there's this grey area that you talked about? Do you think there's an argument to say that it could result in sort of overthinking things and getting too sort of bogged down in your own thoughts? Because you often hear from sort of, particularly in businesses, when you speak to sort of business leaders, and it's a bit of a cheesy expression, but they always go, you know, trust your guts. Like, it's important to trust your gut. But it seems like with this, it's almost the opposite of that, isn't it? It's like, don't trust your gut instinct. Actually stop and think about what your gut instinct is and why something different might actually work.
Absolutely. I mean, I had a conversation a few years ago with somebody at an IP inclusive event who was a partner in a firm that I would describe as quite traditional, in the sense that, you know, the vast majority of the partners there would have been white men. And the person that I was speaking to, he was talking about when he's interviewed people who are, for example, I'm going to the classic patent things, but I think unfortunately it still exists, so I'm going to roll with it. But he would say that if he was interviewing somebody from Oxbridge, perhaps, that he would get a better impression about them than if he was interviewing somebody from a lesser known university. And his gut is actually the fact that the person from Oxbridge spoke in a similar way to him, presented in a similar way to him, understood the kind of social dynamics in a way that somebody else might not have done. And that's what his gut was telling him. So, yes, absolutely question your gut. And I'm, you know, as I said, I'm going through the interview process at the moment, and I almost have it in the opposite direction. As a person of colour, a woman in the patent profession, and having been in my early days on the receiving end of some of that kind of old school thinking, I now probably am flipped completely the other way, so that I probably am harsher on somebody who has that kind of background than I would be of somebody who doesn't have that background. And I have to check myself because, you know, it's not simple enough to think, oh, okay, well, I'm in a minority group as a woman. I'm in a minority group as, you know, a person of color within the patent profession. I have my biases, and my biases against, you know, the subconscious bias works in the opposite direction. So yeah, I think it's super important to not just trust your gut.
Yeah, and building on that, Max, as well, I think, you know, there's extremes of every case. You know, you wouldn't give a job to the first person that walked in the room, I'd hope. You interview people, so you're sort of, you know, at least starting the process of comparison. And there are other biases as well, not just gender. I mean, there's groupthink, and like I said, there's over 100 of them that all come into an interview process as well. Right from the beginning of the you know, putting the job advert out, they start, even defining the role, it starts. And then you can have the extreme of, you know, sitting on a whole load of candidates for 6 months and making no decision. I mean, that, you know, in the extreme is obviously completely the other way. So I think with all of this, you need to bring that sort of pragmatism and balance in. Okay, we need a 3-month process. We're going to interview 5 candidates. we're going to make our decisions within these set times. We're going to keep on that timeline. We're going to have a project plan in effect, or, you know, commit to these outcomes, commit to these dates. But in the same breath, we are going to make as much as humanly possible, and we're flawed as humans, we're going to make an objective decision, which on a role, for example, or promotion, that starts with, you know, even the role creation and the candidate selection, even before you get to interview stage. So I think pragmatism does have to definitely come into it from a business perspective. And there's all sorts of other reasons why businesses can't make decisions. Delegation of authority is another one, and span of control, along with trust and psychological safety. I mean, when you look at the topic of decision making in business, it is quite complex. But I think, you know, just sticking on the topic of unconscious bias, yes, of course, you can take far too long, but
I think one of the easiest ways to mitigate that as well is to introduce diversity into, if we're talking about interviewing, if you introduce diversity into the interviewing process from the beginning. So if you've got a diverse panel, people who've come from different backgrounds, you know, then you don't have to necessarily check yourself constantly. So to your question about whether or not you can then become overwhelmed or inundated by self-questioning and self-thought, you can use other people to help with that as well. So, you know, the way I ask questions in an interview will be very different to the way somebody else does. So as long as you balance it, you can, you know, head off the bias at the pass.
I don't know if this is an outdated idea, but it's definitely something I saw debated a while ago. And the idea of having like blind CVs, is there any sort of use to that, do you think? Is that something that should be encouraged, or does, I don't know, Suzanne, if you want to start on that, and Vandita and Jodie as well, if you had any sort of
What's a
thoughts
blind
on that.
CV?
Mm.
What do you mean by blind? Like no
That's where you don't have a
name?
name, so if you saw, for example, a name that you thought sounded not, you know,
Okay.
not from your country or from elsewhere, or if you saw it was a woman, or if you saw it was, you know, yeah, so you're just looking at it from a completely blank perspective, I suppose. It's something I saw a while ago, but I don't know if it was ever really something that took off or was ever sort of widely rolled out. But the idea was to eliminate any sort of unconscious bias you may have at the first instance, and age as well, another thing that would not be,
Yeah,
you know, included on there. And yeah.
I think they've taken age off a lot of them, because I know
Hmm.
when I was, because it was actually 7 years ago this week that I started at Boult, and I remember when I was talking to the recruiter, they said they took my age off because at the time I was very paranoid about my age, because I was only
Right.
in my mid to late 20s, and it was a big thing. It was my issue. It was my problem, no one else's. But yeah, I think that'd be quite interesting, especially being a woman in IT. At my old company, the amount of times I walked in a room and someone would go, "Oh, I assumed it'd be a man."
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
had that quite a bit. It didn't
Interesting.
bother me. Doesn't bother me at all. But yeah, a lot of people expected a male trainer.
Interesting.
So, but yeah, I think that'd be quite a good idea, I think.
I know, we've just supported some interns that came to us via two of the firms that we use on the EPPP program, I think European Patent Pipeline,
Hmm.
something along those lines. And I know that for the initial phase of the recruitment of candidates, they did blind CVs, because I'd questioned a lot about how, you know, how they get to the people that they recruit onto that. I think obviously by the time they're going to in-person interviews, that sort of falls away,
Of
because
course.
it's
Yeah.
really rude if you just refer to
Hmm.
the person that you meet as high candidate number 3.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I know it is a common practice, or more common practice these days.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think we're talking a lot about recruitment, but I
Mm.
don't know if it's okay to switch the subject
Yeah.
slightly, only a little bit, because I think more problem for me comes into those internal opportunities, because the question we were set really, or, you know, the exam question is, how do we resolve the issue of, you know, almost 50-50 male female coming into the profession at trainee stage, but far less women at leadership stage within
Yeah.
the profession. And obviously the recruitment discussion you know, has an impact on that, and there's lots of things you can do. You can put role descriptions through gender bias language. filters. There's lots of thoughts around that, but I think for me, one of the biggest problems in any male-dominated work environment, whether it be IT, Jodie, really interested to hear your views on this, or engineering or law, is the transition from trainee to partner or senior level. And it's those unconscious bias judgments that are being made at every stage in terms of giving women and others, neurodiverse or foreign accent or whatever, opportunities that come up to learn and grow. So, for example, I was biased against, if that's a term, at my first private practice firm because I was the only trainee that was part-time and a mum at the time. So I actually heard partners say I was told partners said to other trainees, oh, we can't ask Suzanne to help with this opposition because she won't be able to commit the time that is needed to it. So we won't ask her. We're going to ask another trainee if they want to help on this opposition. And I was crying out to do opposition work at the time. So I'm just interested in, Jodie, if you've seen stuff where that's happened in your line of work, and Vandita obviously as well.
Personally, no, I don't think I've not been asked or tasked or not victimized, but excluded because of being a female in IT. Or I work part-time as well. I'm a mum, and I don't find any of that. No, they asked me, like, we've got this project, can you do it? But yeah, no, I don't feel like I'm excluded for being a woman in IT or a mum or anything like that.
From my side, I don't think I've been on so much the receiving end of bias, but I've certainly heard other people say things. For example, I had a colleague who was talking to me, a male manager of a group of 5 or so women, and he commented on how, he was sort of congratulating himself on the fact that he was giving them an easy transition back into role and not trying to give any of the women, too much responsibility if they had come back from maternity leave. And I obviously said to him, how about you speak to them and let them tell you what they want to do rather than you making that kind of assumption for them. And I certainly have it from my side in the other way that I'm a single mother. And I sometimes worry about putting myself forward for things because I know I wouldn't necessarily be able to commit the time that somebody else might be able to. So yeah, I think it's definitely in existence, but maybe it just manifests itself in a way that, as many of these unconscious bias traits do, in a way that people don't have any clue at all that their actions perhaps are not,
It's it's
positive.
almost like I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost like it's come from trying too hard to be in a good place, like saying,
Yeah.
oh, she's a working mum, we won't ask her to do it, but it's like it has a sort of negative impact. You need to, as you say, it goes back to what we said right at the start. You need to take a step back and think about what you're doing and whether this person actually wants to be doing the front and center roles, whether they want to commit the time to doing it. Because as I say, it's almost like they've tried too hard to be positive and saying like, actually, we'll let them have their time off, whatever time they need and stuff. We won't ask them to do the hard work, or we won't ask them to do to commit more time. But
Yeah, and I think there's a practical way of kind of
Mm,
dealing with that as well. I think one of the
mm,
things that people can do is question themselves about why they're making any assumption that they're making, and
mm,
then query whether or not that why is theirs to determine or not. So in this particular case, the why is nice. It's a generous why,
mm,
but then it's not that person's decision to decide whether or not the person returning, wants to be given a softer entry or not.
mm, mm,
Yeah, and in my example, and I have lots of others I've collected over years, it was the outcome would have probably been the same, but it would have been nice to have been asked
mm,
because because the feedback I gave later was I probably could have got Granny to come down for the period of the opposition to help with childcare. You know, a bit of notice and a bit of pre-arrangement. I would have done it, but actually it would have been nice if you had actually had the conversation with me rather than, as you said, Vandita, you know, just exclude on the basis of the presumption that I wouldn't be able to do it. Maybe a valid presumption, but it's kind of not the point. The point is to be included in the conversation to begin with. And I've heard things that, you know, partners making comments in front of trainees that in no way would they ever have someone that's dyslexic work on their team with them.
Jodie, if you don't mind me saying, you said on previous podcasts, haven't you, that you're dyslexic, and obviously
I'm dyslexic, yeah.
Have you sort of experienced that? Maybe not as outward as that, but have you experienced any sort of bias in that, or?
No, but I'm very upfront straight away. I'm dyslexic, so like I've said to you when we were doing this, when I'm typing stuff, if anyone needs anything written, I'm more than happy to do it. But please, can someone check it, because I'm dyslexic. Forming a sentence is not my forte. ChatGPT has been an absolute lifesaver the last few years. I'm not going to lie, but that's what I was saying this to someone earlier. 5 years ago, I would have completely discouraged the idea of getting into a career of writing of any form, whether it be in writing anything legal or just being a self-published person. But now with how technology is going, and obviously it's me with my IT hat on, there's no limits. There's nothing stopping you. So regardless whether you're dyslexic or not, I think the way that technology is going, I think it's making people more able to do things. So for someone to say that they wouldn't have someone on their team because they're dyslexic, there's no real excuse not to, with the technology that we have these days and the support that people can get. Yeah, I've never let it hold me back. I kind of shout it at anyone that I can.
I would say as well that all of these things are born out of ignorance about what it actually means. And so I'm a bit of a shout it from the rooftops, you wouldn't be surprised to know, kind of person anyway. The whole thing with the unconscious bias is that people don't realize they're necessarily doing it. And so there have to be people who are also prepared to highlight it and to educate around it, or send that person off to educate themselves. Because if we don't do that as a collective, then it is the one person that is impacted by it that ends up.
Do you think we are in a position now where people can feel more empowered to call out unconscious bias from sort of whatever guise it takes, and you know, to say actually no, that's not right, or are people still a little bit kind of reticent to call out what they perceive to be unconscious bias, do you think?
I think there's an element of the psychological safety that Suzanne mentioned earlier that plays into this. I personally would feel safe and happy to do it, but I'm a person in a senior position who's also known for speaking out on topics like this. If I was a new trainee in a private practice, then would I? Perhaps not.
It's a really great point. And I remember talking on a panel with Lord Justice Spurs and about men as allies, and we got onto this topic about calling out behaviour. It's really, really, really difficult because you may actually make the problem worse by calling it out. But I do think we are, and you know, and at the moment as well in press and media, we've got lots of fingers pointing. You know, you used a he word and it should have been a they word, and crikey, you know, we're getting really quite you know, not spiteful about it, but you know, using it, weaponizing the fact that one group has power over another group in a way that then isn't sort of great for everybody. And it's back to that sort of presumption and you know, making decisions for people. If you call the behavior out, you're making a decision on the behalf of the person who was subjected to the behavior that may in and of itself be a presumption as well, that you know, they are upset about it or it has impacted them. You know, you're making also a presumption that the person that said the thing is wrong, or there was a problem with their behavior when it could have been obviously genuine mistake. So I think for me, I have called out behavior in the past when perhaps it wasn't useful in the moment. But certainly I think small slip-ups said in a jokey way, oh, you mean the examiner is a they, rather than a he, sort of correcting those ones which are far more accepted and normal. I think, a serious sort of example, I think, would be, little quiet word on the QT more than calling the behaviour out. But really interested in Jodie and Vandita's views on that as well, obviously.
No, I actually entirely agree with that. And I think my use of the phrase kind of call it out is a broader kind of phrase. I think you've just described that beautifully because yes, you're absolutely right. I don't know that I would ever think that the right time and the right place was in that moment to sort of say, you absolutely shouldn't be saying things like, that's just not the way it would work. I kind of, as you were saying it, I was thinking a little bit about my daughter. She's 6 years old and is learning about the world. And I would never tell her that she's wrong. I would simply lead by example. So if there's anything that I witnessed from her, and this is as basic as when she was learning to speak, she would refer to everybody as a she. And, that's she's just learning. And because I know that, there's a little boy that she was playing with that was getting pretty upset that she, persistently was saying she did this, she did that, I would then just quite, clearly start saying he. And, it doesn't have to be a you're wrong, you're exhibiting bias. You can simply demonstrate the behavior that you think.
Yeah.
And again, I'm saying that as somebody then who, as you said, I'm making judgments, but again, it is human nature to do that, and you can't all be so polite that you never try and do it. But equally, yeah, I'm not about to try and shame other people for what they're doing either.
And a similar incident, my brother was my sister and now identifies as male and goes by the name of Miles. And as my daughter, we taught, his name was Lois, and my daughter called him Whis because it was just easier as she was learning to talk. But now she calls him Miles, and she's just taken the transition quite naturally. But once again, she kept saying she. And I felt like I had to keep justifying to my brother. And I was like, I'm so sorry. She doesn't mean anything by it. And he's like, she's 5. It's fine. But yeah, we were out once going on a day out, and I was trying to find out annual passes at the Sea Life Centre, and my daughter's gone to the person serving us, are you a girl? And I was not paying attention, and I've looked up and I was unsure, and I was like, oh no, what's she gonna say? And the person's gone, no, I'm a boy, but I get that quite often. And then my daughter's gone, so why have you got both your ears pierced then? It was like the most innocent thing, and I was wondering what she was going to come out with. But I think as a parent, and I know this is digressing a little bit, it's when they say comments like this and then you're stared at as a parent of what is your follow-up, because that's what we're going to scrutinize. So yeah, lead by example. Like, I try not to tell my daughter she's wrong, but it's just trying to correct her gently.
Gently, yeah.
I think
Gently and kindly.
Yeah, you're so right. I had this with my daughter. She would call ham, as in the meat, Pam, P-A-M. And I was advised to just keep repeating back to her ham. Not correct her, not draw attention to it, not make it a big thing, not make a fuss, but just repeat back to her, oh, so you want a ham sandwich. Now she's 22. She saw this, she'd be mortified, A, but B, I don't think I've ever heard her use Pam since like 6 months after she started that. So, but I think the major point is the leadership by example.
Yeah.
I think that is so key to this topic.
To sort of stress, is to lead by example.
I can give a practical in work example of this as well, and this goes back to parental leave, adoption leave, maternity leave, whatever it is. I've heard way too many people refer to it as, somebody's just come back from holiday or something like that. And again, in those scenarios, it is the, I'm not going to sit here and say, it's not a holiday. I'm just going to very kindly but firmly assert what it actually was. and
Mhm.
move forward from that. So yeah, it definitely shows up in a work context as well.
Yeah.
Good.
And I think you're right. I think that, I've definitely changed my stance over the years from being really bolshy about it
Mm.
and kind of, maybe then making like all of the errors that we just discussed to actually just reframing and reflecting back using the language that is perhaps more or less biased. So exactly in the sort of Pam Ham respect, or, oh, you mean that they were on, their break after, their paternity leave or their maternity leave, and just sort of emphasizing the change in the language and the reflection is probably certainly a minimum that should be done to kind of correct that language without as you say, Vandita, calling someone out.
Excellent. Yeah, I know we're quite close to being out of time on this, and I think it's really interesting. It's nice to sort of think of that positive side of subtle leading by example. But yeah, I just wonder if, Vandita and Jodie and Suzanne, if you had any sort of final thoughts or kind of reasons to be positive for the future, or things to sort of take going forward in the workplace that we could all sort of think about, perhaps. I don't know if you wanted to start, Suzanne, and
Certainly, I think definitely emphasize the, recognize it's a thing. And as Vandita said, it's not necessarily a bad thing. These biases are designed to help us navigate life on a daily basis without, tripping up over our feet and, missing the bus in the morning. Because they lead to, habit forming, and habit forming leads to more efficient pathways in the brain, which means that we can, create the things that we amazingly create. And secondly, I think education, self-education, or corporate education is key. Like I said, there are over 100 different biases, some of which I've never heard of. And the more you look into it, the more you can understand not only how you make decisions as a human being, but how others make decisions around you, and therefore how to guide them through that decision making, whilst at the same time, as you said, Max, not getting bogged down in the process of the decision making in and of itself, which again is probably some crazy bias. But yeah, for sure.
excellent. And Vandita?
Yeah, I would probably say, and I say this for every DEI related conversation, but be curious. So I would hate for somebody to, listening to this, think to themselves, okay, I've had my 7 seconds of unconscious bias. I'm now having a pause to see what I should be doing, shouldn't be doing, and to then not follow through and do anything because they're then paralyzed by the internal voice and doubt. Don't let that get in your way of doing things, but be curious. If you're not sure, ask a question.
Good stuff. And Jodie, any sort of thoughts from you, or?
No, just following on
Mm,
from
mm,
Vandita about the kind of taking the 7 seconds, and just not opening my mouth too quickly and just speaking, and just kind of taking that pause, which unfortunately I need to do a bit more of.
Yeah.
I could just see from your entire body language that that was something that may have happened to you before now on
Yeah, I
occasion.
just jump onto it and I ask questions, and I sit there and think I had the best intentions of asking this question, and it's just come out so wrong. So it's just kind of taking that time, breathe,
Yeah.
be curious.
And I
Stuff.
think saying, like, in that scenario, it's okay to say, oh, I think that I phrased that in a way,
Incorrectly.
or rather, you don't even
Yeah.
need to berate yourself. Don't beat yourself up either. Just say, oh, let me try that again.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think sadly we are out of time. I think there's a lot more that we could say on this, but it's been a really great discussion. So I guess thanks again, Jodie, for helping me co-host, and thanks to you, Vandita and Suzanne, for an illuminating discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.